All right, hey, so we've accomplished a lot in our previous steps. We've laid out our entire application, and guess what? We have a centralized data model in our app.js, in our main application component, where we have a bunch of properties, and all of those properties, they are making their way and spreading their way through the application, and they're controlling the style of the halftone component, how it's rendering. It's controlling all of these properties in this side panel right here. And it also controls the selection, the image that's selected. It's giving it a border around that. And in this next step, we just need to wire those properties up. So when I change the shape type to something like triangles, we need to see triangles right here. So we need change events coming from the side panel, from the images here. And so we're going to do that in this step. But I should mention something that like I said, we've put this data model right in our application component right here. It's a very lucky thing we can actually work with this. So our main application component is kind of holding all these properties hostage, right? So what's happening is that this main application component, it has children. It has a child of this side panel. This floating header is also a child, and so is this floating footer. And so the main application can easily send these properties as attributes to all of its children. And in turn, the children can easily send change events, bubble them up to the application again. And it ends up creating this weird fragile circle. And since we have such an easy application that we're making, at least from a UI standpoint or an organizational standpoint, it works just fine. And the second you have components that they aren't in that direct line of bubbling, or they aren't direct children that you can pass attributes to, it can start getting a little weird and kind of maybe impossible to work with. So there are better strategies for more complex applications. But again, given that this is a pretty simple application, it's gonna work for us. And we'll cover some of these strategies in future episodes. And so the thing I want to start with is just these click events from this floating footer. So being able to save as SVG, save as ping, save as JPEG. So let's add those in right now. Now I'm going to use a few different strategies for dealing with these change events, kind of a mishmash of a bunch of things. And one of those things I like to do is I like to add some, static variables for the event types. So I'm in my index.js in my floating footer right now. And I'm going to add some variables for saving SVG, save ping, save JPEG. And in my markup for my floating footer, in floatingfooter.html, I'm going to add some click events to these action buttons. So now when you click each button, it says dispatch a new event, and we're creating a new event with the event type of these properties that I just added. And it could easily be a string. It could be on save SVG. But then when I listen to this event, what happens if I misspell this? What happens if I do one of these, I make a typo because I don't remember exactly what the event is? Well, it's going to silently fail, and I'm not going to know why. And this is why I've taken to the habit of making these constant variables, so that I'm not mistyping strings, and my IDE or even TypeScript maybe will pick up, hey, you typed this wrong. We don't know what it means. So it's an easy way to catch these things as far as I'm concerned. Ping. So after we've added all these click events, we do need to import save as SVG, these constants. So let's do that. And now I'm going to go back into my application component in our app.js file, and I want a way to catch these events. And I'm going to use a lit function called first updated. And so what first updated does is your component, lit starts up your component, it does what it needs to do, and the first time your component gets updated, it's going to call this function. And so in this scenario, we're using this to add a listener to the shadow root of the component and listen for SVG change events or ping change events. And so, of course, let's try this out now. Let's do save as SVG and see if it fires that alert. There we go. Hi. Now, there's a couple things about using this first updated. You really shouldn't have to use it. First of all, we could easily comment all of this stuff out. and turn to our app.html and say onSaveSVG equals alert of hi. And so let's try that out. It still does the same thing. And honestly, this looks a little nicer. We'd have to add all three of these to this though, which is fine. But let's put this back because, like I said, I am showing just some lifecycle methods of lit, and I'm actually going to use this lifecycle method for a few more things. Now, the other weird thing about this is we're listening through the shadow root. And what happens if we didn't do that? So let's listen for that alert again, and nothing fires. Here's what's happening. So we are listening through the application component, and inside that application component, it has a shadow DOM. So these events don't escape the shadow DOM unless you let them. So let's go over to our floating footer again, where we're dispatching these events. And I'm going to add composed is true. And so what's happening here is we're dispatching this event from this component, not within its own shadow DOM. We're dispatching it from the component itself. So it makes its way from the component into our application component, but now we're letting it escape the application's shadow DOM. And so in our application component here, because we've allowed it to escape the shadow DOM of our application component, the kind of the outer shell of the component can actually listen for this event now. So let's try this with that composed flag. And there we go, we have our alert back. But honestly, I'm perfectly happy listening to the shadow root. So let's leave it like that. Now, actually saving this stuff is a step we'll get to a little bit later as we're finishing up the app. But let's do something that actually works right now. So let's add a click event to the thumbnail buttons. So again, we're doing this at click. We're dispatching event. We are dispatching a custom event with this string called settings change. And I am not making this a constant. I'm leaving this as a string. And I'm being honestly a little bit inconsistent here, but I want this string to be dispatched from a couple different components. And so I don't necessarily know or care where I want to put this constant. So I'm just gonna keep it a string. Now, the other thing that's a little out of date here is that I'm using a custom event. It was only recently I learned that you can subclass the actual event. With custom event, as we did it before, it offers you the ability to add some detail to the custom event and pass for example, I'm passing it the property of image, I'm passing it the value of my photo, and that's how we did things before. We added this detail to the custom event. But now there's a way to subclass the native browser event, and you can get really smart about doing things with subclassing event, and I'll cover that in the future. But for now, I think a lot of people do custom events because maybe they're like me, maybe they haven't learned they can subclass event yet. So let's see how custom event works. So back in app.js, in our application component, I'm going to add something else to first update it. I'm going to add this other listener. So it's going to listen to our settings change event. And like I said, this settings change event is not just going to come from our floating header for our images. It's going to come from a lot of places. So we can ask it, what is the property you want to change? And we just said we want to change the image from our floating header. We're also asking it, what value do you want to change? So let's set this bracket image to the new value that you're getting from the floating header. And as we reload our page again, we can see that we can click on this ISS space station, and by clicking the thumbnail, it sends the change event down to the app, and it loads a new image to be re-rendered. And we can see the selection box around this too, even though it is pretty thin and it's hard to make out probably over video. But yeah, we can change this to any image we want, so that's great. Now, let's work on this side panel. There's a lot of stuff we can change here, so let's get to it. I'm going to start with the side panel.js file. Not the markup, just the component logic itself. I'm going to add a generic function here to send an event, and it's going to do the same thing we just did with the floating header with the images. It's going to generate a custom event where it gets a property and value as parameters here. I'm only doing this because, it's it's a few different lines of code to do all of this, and I'm going to do it in a lot of places because we have a lot of components in this side panel, and I just want to keep it as shorthanded as possible. So now we are going to be editing the side panel markup in our side panel.html, and the first thing we'll do is add this change event to our picker or our combo box. As you can see, we're using that custom function we just created, send event, and just passing it in the property of shape type because that's what this picker does. And we're passing it the value. When the change event comes in, it gets us an event, and we're taking the event.target, which is the picker, and we're getting its current value, which is a change. Now the slider is going to be somewhat different. We're not going to do a change event. We're going to do an input event. Now this is normal HTML like form control behavior. When you have a change event, it's only going to get fired when you actually accept that change. For a slider though, what we want to actually have it be responsive as we're dragging the slider. So I'm listening for the input event instead of the change event, and this will fire every time the slider gets dragged, and it won't just wait for you to stop and accept the slider value change. So this is going to it's going to look a lot more smooth as we drag the slider, and the halftone is going to change in real time as you're dragging it. So it's like I said, it's a lot more responsive. But of course, for the switch, we're going to just go back to the change event and do the same thing. And so next, let's add some change events to the color. And again, this is going to be an input event because I want that smooth, responsive, as you drag the color, it's going to update in real time. And lastly, even though I don't plan to use it quite yet in this step, I'm going to add a change event for our tab. So when the tab changes, this color tab property gets changed to the currently selected tab. And I'm going to change the selected tab, the currently selected tab, to scope.colorTab. And you might see inside panel.js, you might see that I snuck in color tab as a reactive property before, so this should all work. Now, fingers crossed that when we reload this, it's all gonna work. So hopefully we wired everything up right. So let's start with this spread. Let's start with this. And again, this is using the input event rather than the change event. So as we drag, we can see it being completely responsive. So let's change our hexagons to squares. And let's change the inversion. So that works too. That's great. Let's also change the color. This is great. We can see the halftones changing color along with the desaturation and lightness as well. So this is perfect. Everything's wired up, including changing the image as well. So I guess it looks like we're left with a completely functioning app right now that works super well for us. There are some loose ends to finish up, so let's keep moving with the next step.